Welcome to Organist Launchpad, brought to you by the Royal Canadian College of Organists. My name is Noa Kageyama. I am a performance psychologist on the faculty of the Juilliard School in New York, and I work with musicians on how to optimize practice and performance for more effective performances. In this series, we'll be exploring some strategies for managing performance anxiety and having a more positive experience on stage. Years ago, I went to a masterclass taught by one of my childhood idols, Adurahman. And in this masterclass, at the end, he did a little bit of a Q&A, and he was asked about his thoughts on how to manage nerves. Very simply, he said, know thy enemy. In other words, what happens under pressure? Do you tend to get tight in certain parts of your body? Does your breathing change? Do you tend to have different sorts of thoughts? Maybe your thoughts start racing, maybe start worrying about difficult passages coming up. The idea is, the clearer you can be about what happens, the easier it is to plan for these things in advance. What Pomeroy had to say reminded me a lot of something that I heard from my graduate studies advisor in grad school. He often said, when you misdiagnose the problem, you're probably going to misdiagnose the solution. And that's really fitting in the case of performance anxiety because I think our intuition tends to lead us to focus on the wrong things. We end up trying to control a lot of things that we actually don't have a lot of control over, and instead miss out on trying to focus on the things that we actually do have control over. So I thought a good place to begin today would be to try to get to know the enemy, as it were. There are a lot of misconceptions about the anxiety and performance relationship, and in fact, this enemy that we think is a harmful thing can actually be an asset if we understand how to use it correctly. There are a number of theories that I think we tend to operate from. The initial one that I think instinctively pops into our minds when we think about anxiety and performance is the idea that less anxiety is better. That if we can just feel like we do in the practice room, we'd magically perform better. Unfortunately, when you look at our own experience, when you look at the research, it turns out that's not exactly how things work. If you think back to some performances, you've probably had some good performances where you were actually kind of nervous. You've also probably had not so great performances when you've been pretty calm. A popular theory that you've probably heard of that goes back a number of years is the inverted U hypothesis. The idea here is that a moderate amount of anxiety is best. Too much and performance tends to not be so good. Too little and there too performances are not optimal. It's a little bit like the Goldilocks theory where a moderate amount of anxiety tends to work best. It makes a lot of sense, but it turns out things are a little bit more interesting than that. It turns out that each of us has a unique individually optimal zone of optimal functioning. Some folks do their best at a moderate level of anxiety. Other people actually do their best at a relatively low level of anxiety, and then there are a surprising number who actually do their best at a relatively high level of activation. Beyond that, some folks have a pretty narrow range of optimal functioning. Other folks have a relatively broad range of optimal functioning, and so it can vary quite a bit from one person to the next. Turns out that it gets even more interesting than that. Isaac theory helps us understand quite a bit more about our individual responses to anxiety and nerves, but there's one other element that's really important to incorporate. This is multidimensional anxiety theory. And this theory suggests that there are actually two different elements to the stress response. There's a physical component, or somatic anxiety, and there's also a mental component, or cognitive anxiety. In terms of somatic anxiety, this is the racing heartbeat, the tension, the dry mouth, the butterflies in your tummy, all the physical things that happen that are kind of unpleasant, but also really distracting. In terms of mental or cognitive anxiety, this is the second guessing, the doubts, the worries about the audience, and all the mental things that tend to happen under pressure. This leaves us then with two different goals in terms of managing the stress response. Physically speaking, yes, an inverted U hypothesis curve is pretty good for managing what happens to our body. A moderate amount of activation or energy or nerves can be a really helpful way to have your best performances. However, when it comes to the mental side of nerves, less is better. And in fact, if you had to pick one to focus on, I'd argue that the mental side is even more important. Because the more effectively you can be focused on the task at hand, the easier it'll be to disregard all the different physical things that might be happening at the same time. So how does one manage the stress response more effectively? Well, I hope you'll join me in the next video where I'll share some tips on managing the physical aspect of anxiety.